I'm Cheryl, and I am a new knitter, and I am going to give you my top tips for knitting a temperature blanket. When COVID first hit, as someone who works in a hospital, I knew that I needed a way to get rid of some of that stress. And I had knit a couple of hats and thought that I needed something more substantial. And a friend mentioned to me the idea of a temperature blanket. And I thought that this was a good idea. I didn't know that it was going to be so meditative and so helpful to me through the years. So this is my temperature blanket. It's huge. It's the size of a sail. It is a story in yarn, and it's a story starting from July 18th, 2020 to when I finished in 2021. It was a way that I coped, and also when I knit my last stitch, I missed it. So my number one tip is start local. As a new knitter, I was really intimidated by yarn shops, but luckily I found a local yarn shop. I walked in, I told her what my idea was, and she helped me with the right yarns and the right size needles, and we picked out the yarn colors together. And when I picked out her favorite color and put it in my temperature blanket, I had very fond memories. This local yarn shop saved me so many times. When my dog pulled out a whole row, I was so new at knitting, I didn't know how to fix my problems in my blanket, and so I just would show up and they would help me. I loved going there. They became friends. They featured me in a newsletter and my temperature blanket, and I became a part of their world. I did a temperature blanket with my mother-in-law and my sister. Number two, make sure that you buy quality. I did not know what I was doing. Luckily, the yarn shop steered me in the right direction. I knit with Cascade 220 Superwash. This yarn is springy. The colors are very vibrant. I'm so glad that I made the investment in yarn. It's not inexpensive. This is not an inexpensive project, but it will bring you a lot of satisfaction. Make sure that when you start your project, that you invest in good needles. These are number 7s. Make sure that you test the sound, because you're going to be hearing this for a year. I loved the way these slid. I love the sound of them. Hope the mic picks that up. These needles were tethered to my blanket for a year. So make sure that you pick out a good needle. I have knit before in the round with these needles with interchangeable cables. I would not recommend them because when I'm knitting even short, small projects, they tend to get loose. So I really like an adhered needle. Make sure you also test out the flexibility of those cables, because you are going to be knitting very wide and you're going to be scooting your project back and forth over the needles. So make sure that there's a good amount of sturdiness, but also flexibility to your cables. And do not start this project without these caps to your needle. They saved me so many times. Your project will get very heavy. This is a heavy blanket. In the beginning it's easy, but as it gets heavier, it's going to want to pull, those stitches are going to want to pull out. So make sure that whenever you get interrupted or you're at the end of your row, that you put some caps on. It'll save you hours of heartache. Tip number 3, make a map. Any good journey starts with a map. All it was, I just took a piece of cardboard. Luckily, I order from Amazon a lot. I cut that, I punched some holes, and I made a map of what yarns I was going to use at what temperature. So my 90 to 100 was red, 80 to 89 was carrot, coral, gold, yellow, all the way down to -10. I live in upstate New York, so the temperature can vary widely. I would recommend that you buy two of every color. In the middle of my temperature blanket, was going through a lot of yellows and greens, and I ran out, and there was a shortage primarily because of COVID, and so I had to wait about 4 weeks until I got more celery. So you want to make sure that you have enough to start with. You may want to, like I did, show snow. What I did to show snow is anytime it was snowing and it accumulated more than 3 inches, I would knit in white. You also may want to mark special days. For example, when I got vaccinated for the first time, I marked that and the second vaccination with a special color. So you may want to choose a special color ahead of time for birthdays, anniversaries, things like that. I also had a hero of mine die, and I marked that occasion on October 8th with a black row. So again, this is a story in yarn, so I would encourage you to make that investment in different yarns. Also regarding temperature, in order to get a real broad variation of colors, what we did as the three of us who were knitting, we decided that we were going to go to our low temperatures in fall and winter. So that would be the low of every day. So if it started at 40 degrees and went down to 10 degrees, 10 degrees is what I would knit for that day. So I would knit country blue. In summer and spring, we would knit the high of that day. So if it started with, if the day started at 40 degrees and ended at 90 degrees, then I would be knitting red. So that way, if you use that formula, then you're going to get a lot more difference in your temperature blanket. My number 4 tip is let go of perfection. If I had started this with the idea that this was going to be a gift that I would give, or that a lot of people were going to see it, I don't think I would have continued. But with every mistake that I made, it became part of my story. Maybe I was stressed, maybe I was tired. So I embraced mistakes in my blanket, not when my dog pulled it out, but I did embrace mistakes in my blanket, and I encourage you to do the same. I will say this, the ends are really, really difficult to forgive yourself over, because the ends are not perfect, but you are going to knit your temperature blanket and know that this is really your story in yarn. I went back and forth as one day. My mother-in-law did just one pass, and so hers is more of the size of like a lap blanket. But this would fit on our king size bed. Use different stitches. I started incorporating different stitches. Maybe I was in a mood, or I was having a rough time. I would knit purl, or I would do a seed stitch. It just gives it character. So you'll notice that with my temperature blanket, that as you feel it and you run your hands over, you've got all these different stitches in it, and I loved that. I didn't start that until about the 2nd month of my blanket. I wish I'd started that earlier. Don't be afraid to use different yarns. We visited an alpaca farm, and I knit with their wool. You can see it right here. It was a really snowy day, and I used alpaca yarn right here, and that marked that time. It was a really fun time. My number 5 tip is use this as a time to meditate or to think on something that is important to you. You have 220 stitches. I cast on 220 stitches, and I would take my blanket out on the porch, or I would be camping, or I'd be out on a boat, and I would come up with a mantra for that day. Many times I was scared about COVID, working in a hospital. So sometimes I would just knit each stitch and say, I am safe, my family is safe. When people started passing from COVID, I would meditate each stitch and try and send good thoughts for people who had passed or were sick with COVID. It became very meditative for me. I encourage you to do the same. It's one of the reasons why I think I stuck with it for a year, and actually it was 14 months because I got held up by yarn and a trip. Tip number 6, record your temperatures, but fear not if you miss that day. This was not perfect. Sometimes I would go a couple of days without knitting, but if you have a notebook, you can just write down the temperature that day. Remember, for me, it was I would write down the high or the low of that day. I missed a lot of days. Luckily, there is a website you can visit that has your historical temperatures, and I'll include it on my description here. That will give you the history for your area, and you can go up and you can look the temperature up if you missed it. This was something that I grappled with. If I traveled, am I recording the temperature back home, or am I recording the temperature of where I am? And when we traveled, I would sometimes bring the blanket with me, or I would record the temperature of where we were at. So for instance, I live in upstate New York, but we traveled to Iceland, and these stitches right here were the temperature for Iceland. And my thinking behind that was, this was a story of my year. So I was in Iceland, so I was going to knit those temperatures into my blanket so that it was part of my story. So for me, the temperature was always where I was visiting. Number 7, take this blanket everywhere. Now at first it's really easy. It fits into a small bag, but as it gets bigger, bring it with you. I don't know how it is, but I never once spilled on this, and it went boating with me, it went camping, it went to my father's house, it went to the beach, and it just became something that I did. It felt less of a chore that way. If I just knit in the same chair every night, then I think it would feel like a chore. But this was a very portable thing that I did, and I was able to do it without thinking a lot of times, or I was able to meditate. So I took my blanket with me everywhere. I encourage you to do the same. It is your friend, not a chore. My very last tip for knitting a temperature blanket is finish big. I gathered my friends and the other people who I was knitting with, and we all went to that yarn store. They had an area in the back where people can knit. We put on our masks and we knit the last stitches together, and it was very meaningful. I did not know how to cast off. I had been knitting for so long, I didn't even remember how to cast off. The yarn store owner had to help me with that. I also made people listen to my story, and I would go through and describe everything in the blanket. I would explain, this is when we went to the alpaca farm, this is when I got my first vaccination, this was my son's birthday, this was Thanksgiving. So know that you should tell this story. It's important. I videotaped mine because it meant a lot to me, and I missed it. I actually miss not knitting this now that it's done. I encourage you to do this project. It was very meaningful to me. I hope this is helpful. You can like it if it was helpful. You can also ask me questions. Thanks so much for tuning in, and good luck to you. This is a really fun project.